Imagine ruling the world without an army. No banners, no crown, no borders carved into stone, no capital city, no emperor issuing commands. And yet, everyone listens to you. Prices move when you move. Markets shift when you arrive. Entire civilizations depend on your roots, your standards, your rules. This sounds impossible because history trained us to believe a lie, that power comes from kings, that empires rise through conquest, that money is created by states. But long before Rome, before Persia, before Greece ever imagined democracy, there was a people who proved something dangerous. You don't need land to rule the world. You don't need armies to control empires. You just need to control how trade works. They were called the Phoenicians. And almost everything you think you know about money begins with them. They lived on a narrow strip of land along the eastern Mediterranean, trapped between mountains and sea. No fertile plains, no great rivers, no massive population. By every historical rule, they should have been weak. Instead, they became unavoidable. And while other civilizations expanded outward, the Phoenicians expanded sideways, across water, across ports, across connections. They didn't build walls, they built ships, advanced ships for their time, faster, lighter, capable of long-distance travel when most cultures hugged coastlines in fear. They reached Cyprus, North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, southern Spain, and beyond. They established trading colonies, not empires, ports, not capitals, and everywhere they went, they did not conquer. They traded. But trade has a problem that destroys civilizations: trust. If I don't know you, how do I know your silver is real? How do I know your weights aren't rigged? How do I know today's price won't change tomorrow? Most societies solved this with force. Kings stamped coins, armies enforced value, law punished fraud. The Phoenicians had none of that. So they solved it differently. They standardized everything: weights, measures, contracts, pricing expectations. A unit of silver meant the same thing in Tyre as it did in Carthage. A deal made in Sidon carried meaning in Malta. A trader's reputation followed him across the sea. This was revolutionary. For the first time in history, value became portable. Money stopped being local. Trade stopped depending on rulers. Markets began operating across cultures, languages, and borders. And here's the most important part. Phoenician power did not come from issuing money. It came from making money work. They didn't need a king's face on a coin. They didn't need soldiers to enforce contracts. Their enforcement mechanism was reputation. Cheat once, and you were finished everywhere. No port would deal with you, no ship would carry you, no trader would trust you. That invisible pressure was stronger than any law. As Phoenician trade networks expanded, something strange happened. Empires became dependent on them. Kings needed Phoenician ships to move supplies. Armies needed Phoenician logistics. Markets needed Phoenician standards. They didn't rule territory. They ruled access. Ports became power centers. Routes became leverage. Standards became authority. There was no map labeled Phoenician Empire. But their influence stretched across the Mediterranean like a web. Flexible, invisible, hard to destroy. When one city declined, others adapted. When wars erupted, trade rerouted. When empires collapsed, the network survived. That is the difference between territorial power and systemic power. Empires fall when capitals burn. Networks don't. And this is where history quietly changes direction. Because other civilizations noticed. The Greeks copied Phoenician trade practices. The Persians adopted standardized systems of value. Rome inherited it all, but they added something the Phoenicians never needed: force. Once money fused with the state, power became centralized. Coins gained rulers' faces, markets became tools of control. But the original blueprint never disappeared. The idea that real power doesn't sit on thrones, it flows through systems. And once power becomes invisible, it becomes almost impossible to remove. The Phoenicians didn't disappear because their system failed. They disappeared because others learned how to use it. Empires watched carefully. They saw something terrifying. The Phoenicians could be conquered city by city, but their influence survived. Destroy a port and trade moved elsewhere. Burn a city and the network adapted. That was a problem for kings. Territorial empires are rigid. They depend on borders, capitals, armies, and centralized control. When those collapse, everything collapses. But networks behave differently. They bend. They reroute. They survive chaos. The first empire to truly understand this was Persia. The Achaemenid Persian Empire did not rule like earlier kingdoms. It did not try to impose one culture, one language, or one local economy. Instead, it did something far more sophisticated. It standardized systems. Persia controlled territory stretching from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea. Different religions, different laws, different currencies. Trying to rule that with brute force alone would have been impossible. So Persia ruled through infrastructure. They built the Royal Road, one of the most advanced trade and communication networks the ancient world had ever seen. Messages could travel across the empire faster than anywhere else on Earth at the time. But roads alone don't create power. Money does. Persia introduced standardized taxation systems, standardized weights, standardized silver coinage, the derrick. For the first time, economic coordination matched imperial scale. Local rulers kept their positions. Local customs remained intact. But economic rules became uniform. This was a shift. Power was no longer about commanding people. It was about managing flows, money flows, goods flow, information flows. Control the flows and you control outcomes. Persia didn't care if you loved the king. They cared if you paid taxes, followed standards, and kept trade moving. And here's the key insight most history books miss. Persia didn't invent this model. They refined it. They took Phoenician logic and scaled it with imperial infrastructure. Instead of a network without borders, they built a network that made borders irrelevant. Empires, before Persia collapsed when rulers died. Persia endured because the system functioned independently of any one king. That terrified later civilizations. Because once power becomes systemic, removing leaders doesn't remove control. This is the moment where money stops being a tool of exchange and becomes a tool of governance. From this point forward, empires are no longer judged by how much land they conquer, but by how efficiently they organize economic life. Rome copied it. China developed its own version. Islamic caliphates expanded it through trade routes. Every successful empire after Persia followed the same rule. Control trade, standardize value, integrate money into administration. But with each iteration, power became less visible. Coins became symbols. Institutions replaced kings. Systems replaced armies. By the time medieval Europe emerges, most rulers no longer create money. They borrow it. That is not an accident. That is evolution. Because the most powerful position in any system is not the ruler. It is the one who sets the rules everyone else must obey to participate. Phoenicians proved money could rule without borders. Persia proved systems could rule empires. What comes next is when money stops serving power and becomes power itself. And once that happens, history enters a phase it never escapes. Once money becomes systemic, power no longer needs a throne. It doesn't need a crown. It doesn't need an army marching through the streets. It only needs rules. After Persia, the pattern repeats again and again, but each time it becomes harder to see. Rome conquers with legions, but it governs with accounting, taxation districts, census records. Coinage, stamped not just with emperors, but with guarantees of weight and purity. Rome collapses militarily, but its monetary logic survives. The empire disappears. The system doesn't. Medieval Europe inherits a world where kings rule land, but money flows independently of borders. Trade routes reconnect cities faster than armies ever could. Italian merchant families rise not by conquering territory, but by financing it. Florence, Venice, Genoa. Banks emerge not as buildings, but as agreements. Letters of credit replace gold shipments. Risk is priced. Time itself becomes a financial variable. Kings begin borrowing to wage wars they cannot afford. And something fundamental shifts. Power moves away from those who command armies, toward those who decide who gets funded. This is the moment where money stops responding to political authority, and political authority starts responding to money. By the early modern period, this is no longer hidden. Empires are built on debt. Wars are won by whoever can finance longer. Colonies are managed through trade monopolies and currency controls. The British Empire doesn't dominate the world because it has the largest army. It dominates because it controls shipping, insurance, credit, and settlement systems. By the time central banks appear, the transformation is complete. Money is no longer issued to serve rulers. Rulers exist to maintain monetary stability. Central banks are not created to dominate nations. They are created to stabilize systems too powerful to fail. And that is the final evolution of the Phoenician idea, from coins to systems, from trade to governance, from kings to managers. Today, nations still have flags, they still have leaders, they still hold elections. But the real constraints are invisible: interest rates, liquidity, credit access, currency confidence. Modern governments do not rule in the old sense. They administer, they manage budgets, they respond to markets, they negotiate with institutions that cannot be voted out. This is why revolutions change faces, but not systems. Empires fall, currencies remain, debt survives, regime change. Because once money becomes infrastructure, it doesn't care who's in charge. It only cares that the system keeps running. And that is the most important lesson of this entire story. The most powerful systems in history were not built to dominate people. They were built to organize participation. If you want to live, trade, work, or grow inside them, you must accept their rules. Phoenician merchants understood this instinctively. Persian administrators formalized it. Modern institutions perfected it. And that's why the world we live in feels familiar but uncontrollable. We still talk about rulers, but power moved long ago. If this helped you see history differently, if it made the present make more sense, this channel is about uncovering those hidden patterns. Subscribe, and we don't keep tracing how money quietly shaped the world you live in, long before you were ever part of it.